What if I told you that China has always intended, and still intends, to gain control over Ukrainian territory through the hands of the Russian Federation? Because it has long dreamed of taking far too much from our country. Our technologies, a land, a geopolitical position, all while keeping its hands seemingly clean. And I have arguments, both documentary and from personal experience. In Ukraine, China was especially interested in missile and space technologies, aircraft construction, unique helicopter engine designs, and naval assets. Back in 2013, Beijing even unveiled a plan in which a new Silk Road was to pass through Ukraine, a project that promised China the same global dominance and prestige it once held centuries ago. This route was meant to link the Far East with Europe. Today, it's clear that China is providing assistance to our enemy, to Moscow. And this support isn't just economic or military. China is also helping to plunder Ukraine in the occupied territories. Yet the world continues to maintain a facade of neutrality toward Russian aggression, despite the security guarantees Ukraine received in 1994. My name is Oleksa Kibkalo, and today we'll be talking about China's interest in the Russian-Ukrainian war. I first learned about China's interest in Ukrainian technology back in the early 1990s, from my uncle, who worked at the Yuzhmash machine building plant. At the time, under a contract with Beijing, Yuzhmash manufactured and delivered a launch vehicle and several modules, along with the accompanying documentation for assembly. Soon after, China arranged for a delegation of Ukrainian engineers to visit and assist in assembling the rocket components. My uncle was part of that delegation. I remember how, after coming back, he came to visit us and brought small household souvenirs from China, little toothbrushes and a tiny comb. I remember how I twisted some small toothbrushes and a comb in my hands, remarked to myself that they were worse in quality than Soviet ones, and even more so than Ukrainian ones. However, I was interested in the trip itself and, skipping the creeps of my relatives' admiration for Chinese architecture, I asked what they were doing at the factory. That's when I heard his comments. He said that with the provided blueprints and technical documentation, any mid-level Ukrainian engineer could have easily assembled the modules and completed the build. However, the Chinese staff did not succeed, so China paid rough money for a team of Ukrainian specialists to conduct a master class. My uncle noted the surprising number of video cameras recording the Ukrainian engineers' every move. He said that was the start of China's large-scale missile program, with significant contributions from Ukrainian defense industry specialists, as confirmed by technical publications. Those same sources also state that Ukrainian engineers helped China launch production of the Rode 120 engine, the very engine used on the Zenit rocket. And that gave rise to China's own missile manufacturing. When I asked my uncle why we were teaching them to make engines instead of just selling them finished rockets, he replied that a strategic partnership was being planned between the two countries. In addition, China paid well. At that time, China didn't receive such a gift from Moscow, since the Kremlin was opposed to it. In 30 years, China has advanced its missile industry to launch spacecraft and produce nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. Meanwhile, Ukraine, largely due to poor governance and constant interference from our northeastern neighbor, has essentially destroyed its own missile industry, and is now desperately trying to revive it in the midst of a full-scale war. And it remains unclear what exactly motivated the shutdown of the Crim 2 missile program at Yuzhmash back in 2019. Interestingly, China's aircraft carrier program also started with a military ship that originally came from Ukraine. Their first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, is a refurbished and fully completed version of the unfinished cruiser Varyag, whose hull was originally constructed at the shipyard in Mykolaiv, Ukraine. In fact, Russia's only operational aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, was also built in Mykolaiv. Here's the story: in 1998, the Varyag was sold for a mere $20 million to a buyer from Macau, who claimed that it would be converted into a hotel and entertainment complex. But the ship quickly came under Chinese control. Following extensive modernization, in 2012, the Liaoning proudly set sail near China's shores as the country's very first operational aircraft carrier. And frankly, $20 million wasn't such a bad deal, especially when compared to how Ukraine's Black Sea Fleet assets were sold off to shell companies. Submarines were going for as little as $6,000. The Varyag had one unique Ukrainian innovation, the ski jump ramp for aircraft takeoff, designed by engineers in Mykolaiv. The most important element is the ramp from which the planes take off. Its profile is a curve known among mathematicians as the Witch of Agnesi or Bezier curve. This curve represents the perfect wave shape and, at the same time, serves as the ideal ramp for an optimal aircraft takeoff. This exact same type of ramp can also be found on the Russian Admiral Kuznetsov, which was also built by the skilled shipbuilders in Mykolaiv. Later, China commissioned 2 more copies of the Ukrainian Varyag, this time built at domestic shipyards. In the early 1990s, Russia sold China 2 more aircraft carriers, the Kiev and the Minsk, as tourist attractions. Symbolic, isn't it? I have no doubt that before transforming those ships into theme parks, Chinese engineers thoroughly studied every single detail of them, examining everything down to the very last screw. Today, military shipbuilding in Ukraine is in the same state as our missile industry, barely surviving. We've outsourced the construction of 2 corvettes to Turkey. Their names, Mazepa and Vyhovsky. Let me also mention the story of Motor Sich. We'll return to that later. For now, let's turn directly to China's broader interest in Ukraine. I recently came across an article titled The Motor Belt and Road Initiative, a foundation for China's growing economic expansion, authored by Lilia Ukrainets, a candidate of economic sciences. The first thing that caught my eye was the date, 2013. The year President Xi Jinping first presented the Belt and Road Project. The article's abstract clearly states that the true goal of this incredibly ambitious and costly initiative had been revealed.
The true objectives of the Belt and Road Initiative, from the perspective of its initiators, have been revealed. These include expanding exports, enlarging markets for goods and services of the new economy, diversifying China's overland export routes to reduce dependence on the United States as its primary trading partner, and securing access to natural resources, particularly fuel and energy, in Central Asia and Africa. Other goals include increasing direct foreign investments by Chinese companies, balancing economic development rates across the region, easing pressure on China's domestic labor market caused by a slowing economy, and establishing a currency zone for the Chinese yuan in Central and Southeast Asia.
So what is this project really about? It is a transport and economic initiative aimed at connecting China with the outside world to the west, by land and by sea. The goal is to create independent, alternative trade routes for goods and raw materials that would allow China to reduce its reliance on the United States. And China is ready to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to achieve this. If we look closely at the original blueprint, the land route was planned to run through the central and western regions of Ukraine. While a connection through Russia was included, the key segment of the route did not go through Russian territory. Thus, the Kremlin couldn't block goods movement in this land corridor, even if it wanted to. In fact, I'd go further. Under the original plan, Moscow's only access to the new Silk Road would have been through Ukraine. Beijing was careful to prevent Russia from gaining economic leverage over China. At the same time, an aggressive vassal like Putin in the Kremlin serves China's interests quite well. On the other hand, Beijing was well aware of the influence of the Western world, in particular the United States, in Ukraine, as well as the adherence of Ukrainians to Western values and the growing rift with the Russian Federation. Therefore, if China wanted a guaranteed route to Europe through Ukraine, it would be in Beijing's interest to see Kiev distance itself from the West. On the other hand, Putin could have become an additional motive to accelerate his gain of influence over Ukraine in order to get more out of what is probably the largest economic geopolitical project. Let's go over the timeline of what I believe are closely connected events. In 2012, Xi Jinping becomes the head of China's Communist Party. He first announces the vision of a vast economic corridor in fall 2013. One Belt, One Road. In December 2013, during Viktor Yanukovych's visit to Beijing, Ukraine and China signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation. The legal framework of Ukraine-China relations shows peak diplomatic activity, including agreement signings and strategic declarations, during Viktor Yanukovych's presidency. After the beginning of Russian aggression, after the annexation of Crimea by Moscow and the occupation of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, not a single new agreement was signed. I believe every Ukrainian deserves to know the content of the treaty signed between Ukraine and China on December 5, 2013. Because it reveals the deeper cause and effect chain, one that clearly exposes Beijing's true stance toward Ukraine and its long-term ambitions on our soil.
The parties emphasized that firm mutual support on issues of national sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity is a key component of the strategic partnership between the two countries. Both sides firmly support each other in choosing their own path of development in accordance with their national conditions, and they endorse each other's efforts to safeguard national independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, as well as to ensure political and social stability and the development of their national economies. Neither party shall, in accordance with its domestic laws and international treaties to which it is a party, permit the establishment on its territory of any separatist, terrorist, or extremist organization or group that undermines the sovereignty, security, or territorial integrity of the other party, and shall prohibit their activities.
This comprehensive and explicit provision should have blocked any economic relations between China and the occupied territories of Ukraine. It should have prevented direct trade, the supply of equipment, and the purchase of goods and raw materials, because such actions directly undermine Ukraine's sovereignty. Let's move on.
The Ukrainian side reiterated its strong and unwavering commitment to the One China policy, reaffirmed that the government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legitimate government representing all of China, and acknowledged that Taiwan is an inseparable and inalienable part of China's sovereign territory. Ukraine opposed any form of Taiwanese independence and expressed its support for the peaceful development of cross-strait relations, as well as the peaceful reunification of China. China, in turn, highly values Ukraine's unilateral renunciation of nuclear weapons and its accession in 1994 to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapon state, in accordance with United Nations Security Council Resolution 984 and China's statement of December 4, 1994, on security assurances to Ukraine. China undertakes unconditionally not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, a non-nuclear weapon state, and to provide appropriate security assurances in the event of an invasion or threat of invasion involving nuclear weapons.
I became curious about the content of the statement made by China on December 4, 1994, in response to Ukraine's renunciation of nuclear weapons at the time of the signing of the Budapest Memorandum. It turns out that the text is not easy to find. The statement has no official Ukrainian translation despite many references. A politician suggested keeping the document in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives. I submitted a formal request to the MFA, asking for a copy of China's security assurances to Ukraine in connection with the 1994 nuclear disarmament. Unfortunately, there has been no response, and nor does it seem one will be forthcoming. There is speculation that Ukraine's original copy may have been destroyed. I hope that is not the case. However, I was able to find a photocopy of the Chinese copy kept by the Chinese government. What you see here is a copy and a machine translation of the security assurance statement, which was delivered as an official diplomatic note from China.
The Chinese government welcomes Ukraine's decision to eliminate all nuclear weapons on its territory. It expressed gratitude for Ukraine's ratification of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear state. China fully understands Ukraine's request for security assurances. The consistent position of the Chinese government is that it unconditionally refrains from using or threatening to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states and territories free of nuclear weapons. This position applies to Ukraine as well. The Chinese government urges all nuclear-armed countries to make similar assurances to enhance the security of all non-nuclear states, including Birdland. China has always opposed the practice of political, economic, and other forms of pressure on state relations, advocating for the peaceful resolution of differences and disputes through equal consultations. China adheres to the spirit of the joint communiqué between China and Ukraine on the establishment of diplomatic relations, dated January 4, 1992. As well as the joint communiqué between Ukraine and China on October 31, 1992, and the joint statement between China and Ukraine on September 6, 1994. China recognizes and respects the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and is ready to continue developing friendly and cooperative relations between China and Ukraine based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
However, Beijing never condemned the aggression of the Russian Federation, even when Putin announced the readiness of his nuclear forces. Instead, China accused the United States of failing to fulfill the Budapest Memorandum, implying that America's partners could no longer count on reliable support. An article published on the CGTN website highlighted how the United States, under the pretext of formal justifications, has consistently avoided fulfilling its security guarantees to Ukraine. Indeed, we clearly remember the shameful and cowardly behavior displayed during the first 2 weeks of full-scale aggression. The article also mentioned that US presidents have used Ukraine for their internal political struggles. This, by the way, led to a series of justifying materials being published in US media. A particularly offensive article in Voice of America, from Ukraine's perspective, seriously undermined the very idea and spirit of the agreements made during Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, all while hiding behind complex legal arguments and casuistry. We are preparing a publication on how our country was pushed out of the nuclear club, and this material is at least sensational. It clearly proves that the destruction of Ukraine's nuclear potential was carried out according to a detailed plan that had been developed in Moscow a full decade before Ukraine even gained its independence. The Russians already understood that the Soviet Union was falling apart, and the states were confused, so they agreed to ready-made solutions from their archenemy in the Kremlin. The Russian Federation has yet to settle with Ukraine for warheads and missile components worth hundreds of billions of dollars. However, let's return to China's behavior. After accusing the US of betraying Ukraine, China, over 11 years of Russian aggression against our country, including more than 3 years of full-scale invasion, has never condemned Russia's aggression against Ukraine, thereby violating its own security guarantees, even the meager guarantees that any non-nuclear state could rely on. Instead, in the 4th year of the full-scale invasion of Donetsk and the occupied Crimea, it is increasingly common to hear about China's interaction with terrorist and separatist groups in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Of course, official Chinese media or representatives of Chinese companies will not openly advertise cooperation with Moscow's Gauleiters in the occupied territories, as this would almost automatically lead to sanctions from the US and Europe. Yet, the Kremlin's appointed figures periodically talk about China's activity. Let me provide a few examples. For instance, reports on the shipment of a production line from China to the Karansky granite quarry, located in the town of Mern in the Telmaniv district of occupied Donetsk region. This information came from the fall of 2023. It indicated that the Chinese-made line was supposed to start operating in December 2023, processing crushed stone. It is now known that Ukrainian granite from this quarry is being used for road construction and housing in the occupied territories. The enterprise operates in multiple shifts, providing the occupiers with building materials for constructing strategic highways to Mariupol, Volnovakha, and Ambrosivka. Reports from the occupation authorities also revealed that the products from the quarry are used for the land corridor linking Moscow with Crimea, and materials are also being sent to road construction in Russia itself. Further details were provided by the publication Real Gazeta. At the heart of this cooperation are connections between the so-called Prime Minister of the Donetsk People's Republic, Yevhen Solntsev, and a representative of the Russian-Chinese Center for Humanitarian Cooperation, Zhong Jingwei, a Chinese graduate student from the South Federal University in Rostov-on-Don. Both were involved in projects under the patronage of Sergei Kiriyenko, first deputy head of the Russian presidential administration and current Kremlin curator of the occupied territories. Solntsev is a graduate of the School of Governors, the highest school of public administration of the Russian Federation, which is also overseen by Kiriyenko. Zhong Jingwei's career was propelled by winning a competition for leaders in Russia, where Kiriyenko chairs the supervisory board. It was the Chinese leader of Russia who helped the DPR Prime Minister establish contacts with Chinese companies. Zhong Jingwei is from Shaanxi, Hainan province, where the two companies supplying equipment to the Karansky quarry are located. According to Real Gazeta, the attempts of the occupying authorities to bring Chinese businesses to the occupied territories continue. I quote, Solntsev constantly travels to Harbin for international forums. Unofficially, but contacts between politicians and businesses are occurring. Meanwhile, Putin is organizing an international economic forum in St. Petersburg, where large installations from the so-called LPR and DPR are displayed, and Chinese representatives attend. They sit with them, talk. This is according to the chief editor of Real Gazeta, Andriy Dmitrienko. Production lines for mining enterprises are always individual orders, as they need to take into account the peculiarities of the mining location and the specifics of extracting minerals. This specific order was completed by a Chinese company that clearly knew where the enterprise was operating. Moreover, engineers from the company had to visit the site to study the client's needs and make calculations for the structures based on the terrain and local conditions. According to Russian media sources, cooperation with Chinese partners in the occupied territories continues. The news from the occupiers highlights two companies, the Amma Construction Machinery Factory, which manufactures equipment for crushing rocks, and the Johnson Heavy Industrial Machinery Factory, which produces sorting and crushing equipment. Photographs from the quarry also show dump trucks from the Chinese company LGMG, model MT86H. Although these are marketed in the Russian Federation, it is possible that Moscow-based entrepreneurs are acting as intermediaries. There is also information from Luhansk's collaborators that a Chinese company is supplying packaging lines to pasta manufacturers in the occupied territories. The company in question is Avanti. These lines are also custom-made. It seems that China is also willing to buy products manufactured in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Evidence of this comes from reports from the occupiers about the Luhansk Niva enterprise that produces pasta. It mentions that products will be delivered to Chinese store shelves. Meanwhile, the Russian Pромsvязьbank has started trading Chinese yuan in the occupied Luhansk region. According to the occupiers' website, it seems that China has no objections to this. At the time of writing this article, there are no condemnations from official Beijing that currency from the Celestial Empire helps to hold the occupied territories of Ukraine by the aggressor. This is clearly an unfriendly stance towards Ukraine. Although the logical consequence of such actions should be a ban on selling yuan to the Russian Federation. In reality, the financial sectors of Russia and China are becoming increasingly intertwined. An interesting fact was published on the website of the U.S. Congressional Research Service, showing that dollarization of the economies of Russia and China from 2013 to 2023 reached 50%. This process was initiated alongside President Xi Jinping's statement about creating a new Silk Road and occurred during Russia's aggression against Ukraine. As a result, Russia's foreign currency reserves are now backed by the yuan. According to various economic expert groups, this allows Moscow to avoid the catastrophic consequences of being unable to store assets in dollars and euros. According to the materials provided by Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service for 2024, the yuan is being actively used to support and stabilize the Russian national currency, helping to prop it up amidst ongoing economic challenges. Furthermore, the Russian government is investing Chinese currency in state enterprises. By purchasing bonds from strategically important companies using reserves from the National Welfare Fund. The goal is to try to support the economy amid limited access to foreign markets. In particular, 3 billion yuan was spent on this in July, 2,750 million yuan in August, 2 billion yuan in September, and 1,250 million yuan in October. I also found interesting the visit of Chinese bloggers to the newly occupied Donetsk and Crimea in 2023. There, they met with Pushilin and Aksyonov. I propose two quotes from Chinese leaders' thoughts.
If we have a Russian visa, we can visit any region. If Ukraine has any questions, it can clarify them with the Russian authorities. And Ukrainians who visit Taiwan did not have Chinese visas. I would like to draw attention to the work of a French journalist who created a documentary film focused on the actions of Ukrainians in Donbass, providing a detailed portrayal of the situation there. This film was banned. Here's an example of the actions of the Ukrainian authorities.
Indeed, with a Russian visa to the occupied part of Ukraine, we don't care, and if something is wrong, deal with Russia, after they have not even condemned the aggression, after they supported the aggressor's economy. And the next quote.
We noticed the reaction of the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and would like to say that our multi-million audience wants to see independent information about Donbas. The statement by the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is an example of double standards. On September 9, the Ukrainian delegation visited Taiwan. It is necessary to find out if this harms relations between the nations. This visit to Taiwan caused an uproar in China. Let's recall the situation with Motor Sikh when Ukraine refused to compensate for huge losses.
I will make the same arguments. After supporting the Russian Federation in its aggression since 2014, you also tried to seize the strategic enterprise Motor Sikh through an opaque scheme involving Chinese front companies. This was uncovered in 2017. By the way, one of the main reasons behind President Zelensky's team deciding to confront China over the factory in 2019 was their strategic emphasis on maintaining friendly relations with the United States, which was seen as crucial for Ukraine's future. The US publicly opposed the sale of Motor Sikh to Chinese investors in 2019. US National Security Advisor John Bolton, speaking in Kiev, stated that China had stolen the F-35 fighter jet technology, and a similar theft of military technologies could await Ukraine. However, between the lines, it was clear that Motor Sikh would strengthen the military capabilities of the Celestial Empire, creating additional risks for the United States. Because, by acquiring the factory, China would gain technologies and production capacities that would allow it to dominate the skies. Ukraine has always been a reliable partner, and the guarantees for our security. Well, you can see for yourselves. And here's more, a selection of facts from the NV publication. In 2024, the first Russian-Chinese construction forum was held in Heilongjiang province, attended by the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic government, Yevhen Solntsev, as well as representatives of the Donbass Development Corporation. This was reported by the Russian newspaper, Komsomolskaya Pravda. What was called their investment potential in the DPR was presented to the leadership of the Wuhan Project and Research Institute of Ferrous Metallurgy, which is already implementing several projects for the Russian Federation. The aforementioned Solntsev tried to persuade the institute's representatives to participate in launching and modernizing metallurgical enterprises in occupied Donetsk. In turn, the Kremlin is offering broader involvement, trying to integrate the occupied territories into the international transport corridor Europe-Western China, which stretches 9,000 kilometers. Yes, this is a mutation of the One Belt, One Road project. It seems that they changed it, taking into account Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territories. On those 2,500 kilometers within the aggressor state, the road unites three major agglomerations, Moscow, Kazan, and Samara-Tolyatti. Currently, the Russians are reconstructing the road from Rostov-on-Don to Mariupol, Melitopol, Simferopol, which they call the Federal Highway R-280 Novorossiya. Its length is 635 kilometers. The road passes through Rostov region and the occupied Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea regions. With this logistics route, the Russians plan to attract as many Chinese companies as possible to the regions they have seized. The Kremlin is already trying to do so, as reported by the local propaganda publication Khersonsky. Last year, a group of Chinese entrepreneurs visited the occupied coastal part of Kherson region, the village of Koryan, the city of Skadovsk. The Russians tried to interest East Asian entrepreneurs in local ports and the possibility of supplying agricultural equipment to the region. But the main goal is land connection to Europe. Therefore, the risk arises that China may support the continued expansion of aggression to secure a corridor to Romania or Hungary. If you look at the map, you will understand what I mean. I am leading to the point that now, out of the 5 countries that guaranteed Ukraine security in exchange for nuclear disarmament, 3 do not even formally fulfill their obligations. The Russian Federation is the aggressor. The United States allows talks about Ukraine losing its territory and exerts pressure for the ephemeral appeasement of the aggressor. And China helps the aggressor maintain the occupied territories and loot the Ukrainian state and its people. I once again emphasize that, in this situation, we must act as prudently, firmly, and pragmatically as possible. the facts presented are enough to begin consultations on protecting Ukraine with the most powerful weapon in the world. We must secure nuclear protection. And the way forward will depend on the world our allies want to live in. Finally, an extremely talented people who do not know how to value their skills, intelligence, strength, or country. And because of this, those who want to take it all appear. As a journalist, I have no other way to influence the conscience and mindset of politicians except to share this story with the viewers. To suggest that you choose more carefully those we bring to power. And those who are in power must be strictly controlled and not given any leeway. Otherwise, we will pay again with our blood, feeling deceived and humiliated. And those who profited from us will quietly warm their bones on the French Riviera and watch as their grandchildren play carelessly in the warm sea waves. And your children, your grandchildren, will hear explosions in the Russian language, possibly with a Chinese accent. This was Oleksa Kibkalo and the 24 Channel team.
Burn, soul, burn, but do not complain. Today, Putin is feeding you yet another portion of Moscow-style nonsense, though in reality, it's just Chinese nonsense. He says that we pitied Ukraine, that we made the decision to give it 15 billion, and that we're willing to offer everything, as if we're doing it out of pure charity. He claims we'll even sell it gas at a reduced price, trying to make it seem like an act of benevolence. Don't forget that your debts are bought by your enemies.